Cinema 4K 10-bit 24p. Aperture is 1.1. Shutter is 2500. ISO is 80. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 10-bit 24p. 80 ISO, 800 on the shutter, and 2.7 on the aperture. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 3.4 on the aperture, 320 on the shutter, and 80 on the ISO. This is with my 75 to 300 adapted with the Metabone speed booster. Okay, this is the same thing in Vlog. Standard picture profile, sun. Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, aperture 2.9, shutter 320, and ISO 80. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, 5.6 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and ISO 80. This is Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit Vlog, 5.6 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 320 on the ISO. 10-bit Cinema 4K 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 160 on the shutter, 80 on the ISO. This is Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit Vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 200 on the shutter, 320 on ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit Vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 320 on the shutter, 320 on the ISO. This is the hybrid log gamma on the Cinema 4K 10-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 1000 on the shutter, and 320 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 8-bit 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 160 on the shutter, and 80 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 80 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, ISO 80.
When you meet them, they're very down to earth people. Yeah, no. And honestly, that's the way we try to handle all of our engagements when we're working. It's not,
okay, so this is Cinema 4K 24 bits, or 24p 10 bits. Vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 100 on the shutter, 320 on the ISO. This is Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 100 on the shutter, and 320 on the ISO. Okay, this is the Cinema 4K 10 bits hybrid log gamma. 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 320 on the ISO. So this is what it looks like with the last bit of daylight in the Cinema 4K 10 bit standard profile, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 80 on the ISO.
Got these shadows looming over them.
Yeah, so I was really excited actually.
This is Cinema 4K 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 400 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. Cinema 4K 10 bits, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 80 on the shutter, and 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be the higher ISO.
With the what's the juggernaut? The Amazon, the Google.
Cinema 4K 10 bits, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 800 on the ISO.
I mean, he should be charging more. I mean, when there's less competition. Yeah, I mean, he was just trying to undercut with
Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 800 on the ISO.
Doesn't make sense. You're not like letting all those $10,000 games through. They got nowhere to go, but keep going for it, I guess.
This is Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits Vlog. Aperture is 1.1, shutter is 50, ISO is 6400.
So, I mean, and so
Have you heard of this?
if he's charging $10,000, you know?
So this is Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 80 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. This is Cinema 4K 10 bits, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 80 on the shutter, and 6400 on the ISO. Okay, so this is Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 2500 on the ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, 50 on the shutter, 1.1 on the aperture, and 3200 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 50 on the shutter, 1.1 on the aperture, 3200 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. This is Cinema 4K 10 bits, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 10-bit, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO.
You gonna get it?
Oh yeah. Okay, this is Cinema 4K, 24p, 10-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2000 on the ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 10 bits, 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. Okay, this is going to be a test of how it looks here through all of the ISOs. Currently I'm on ISO 80. I'm at Cinema 4K with 24p, 8-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 80 on the ISO currently. Now I'm going to go up to 100, that is 100 ISO, 125, 160, 200, 250, 320, 400, 500, 640, 800, 100, I'm sorry, 1000, 1250, 1600, 2000, 2500, 3200, 4000, 5000, 6400, 8000, 10,000, 12,800, 16,000, 20,000, 25,600, 32,000, 40,000, 51,200, 64,000. This is the high extended, 80,000, 102,400, 128,000, 160,000, 200, and 4,800. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 30 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. This is Cinema 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 5000 on the ISO. Okay, this is 24p Cinema 4K 10 bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 8 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 128 on the ISO. 4K 24p 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 10-bit 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be native ISO. This is Cinema 4K 8-bits 24p, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, it's 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be native ISO. Cinema 4K 24p 8-bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. We will see if we have any noise here. I'm going to bump it up to 6400, I think. Alright, this is Cinema 4K 8-bits, 24p, 6400 on the ISO, 50 on the shutter, 1.1 on the aperture. These people walk by, let's see how it looks.
We might have been in a picture, huh? Yes. He's waiting for us to move.
How's it going?
Sorry,
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you're fine.
Didn't even see it down here.
No worries. Okay, this is Cinema 4K 24p 10-bit vlog, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. Okay, this is the Cinema 4K 10-bit 24p hybrid log camo, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. Okay, so this is just a test to see the ISO levels. It's a pretty dark area of the park, except there are some little street lamps around. Right now we're at Cinema 4K 24p 8-bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, currently ISO 80, and I will be going up on ISO starting now. ISO 100, ISO 125, ISO 60, ISO 200, ISO 250, ISO 320, ISO 400, ISO 500, ISO 640, ISO 800, I'm sorry, ISO 1000, ISO 1250, ISO 1600, ISO 2000, ISO 2500, which is supposed to be a native ISO on the high end, ISO 3200, ISO 4000, ISO 5000, ISO 6400, ISO 8000, ISO 10,000, ISO 12,800. ISO 16,000. ISO 20,000. ISO 25,600. ISO 32,000. ISO 40,000. ISO 51,200, and that's as high as I'm going to go. There's a couple more, but there's no point. Okay, this is a Cinema 4K, 24p, 10-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 2500 on the ISO. This is supposed to be the high native ISO. Cinema 4K, 24p, 10-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K, 24-bit, 24p, 8-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 6400 on the ISO. Let's go by because it'll look cool. Okay, this is Cinema 4K, 24p, 8 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be native ISO.
Camera work.
How's it going?
Did you?
Cinema 4K, 24p, 10-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, 2500 on the ISO. It's supposed to be a native ISO. This is Cinema 4K, 24p, 10 bits. With 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 6400 on the ISO. Okay, this is Cinema 4K, 24p, 10 bits, 1.1 on the aperture, 50 on the shutter, and 2500 on the ISO, which is supposed to be a native ISO. So this is Cinema 4K, 24p, 8-bit, 1.1 on the aperture, 125 on the shutter, and 6400 on the ISO. See how that looks. I think that's going to conclude my test.